With the concerns over American funding for Ukraine increasingly part of the European narrative on the American presidential election, maybe not so much the American narrative, but certainly it's part of the discussion on the European side. Um, there's been increasing speculation that there may be a need for NATO boots on the ground in Ukraine. There's an analysis piece in the Eye. It's actually from exactly the same page as my last video regarding Russia's press ganging of foreign recruits. And this piece is about the possibility, the increasing possibility that we may need to consider a war with Russia. Um, this report is by, or this analysis piece, I should say, is by Hamas to Bretton Gordon. He is a former commander of UK and NATO CBRN, chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear forces. So he's a senior military figure, and this is his take on it. It makes for some interesting reading. I'm just going to read it out. It's not too long, so bear with me. NATO has maintained peace for 75 years, but if it does not prepare for war in Europe now, it could be at war with Russia by its 76th birthday. It has the military power to deter Russia, but needs a political will to put it on show. If this means boots on the ground in Ukraine, we must do this. With the world focused on the dreadful events in Gaza, Putin is preparing for a massive spring offensive, and NATO must be ready to react to prevent war across Europe. Over the weekend, reports allege that Russia is using chemical weapons against Ukraine's forces. It must be clear by now that Vladimir Putin has no limits, and the time to act is now. Yet, despite our Foreign Secretary's trip to Washington, this is regarding David Cameron going to meet Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago and also to shore up support for funding for Ukraine. My words. Yet, despite our Foreign Secretary's trip to Washington, there's no indication that action will be taken by the UK. Putin will be delighted and hoping that this malaise will continue, but it must not. Seismic shifts are threatening NATO stability, for example, the delay of US weaponry and the spectre of Donald Trump 2.0, which is exactly what the US must, which is exactly why the UK must show more leadership on Ukraine. Lord Cameron's comments to the BBC last week, especially his remark that NATO should not put boots on the ground in Ukraine, shows where the UK is lacking in this area. If we can get that money out of the US Congress, if we can get Ukraine the arms they need, if we can show Putin that he can't outwit us, and that Ukraine is going to fight back and win back more of its territory, he said. Far too many ifs there, and if by saying no boots on the ground, Putin has already outwitted us. We need strategic ambiguity to keep Russia guessing rather than just telling them our plans. That seems to me very smart. Why tell Russia what we're going to do? What Putin has is a mass of tanks, a mass of soldiers, and he's undeterred by casualties. Bear in mind Russia suffered enormous casualties. And regardless of what the precise figures are, it's clear that thousands of Russian soldiers have died. Tens of thousands. Ukraine does not have the same mass or ammunition to hold this onslaught indefinitely. Lord Cameron must get this from the US this week. Many in the West and NATO seem to be preparing for war in the distant future, but this is time we may not have. Our politicians and the people of the UK need to get real to the possibility of war in Europe in the next few months, not in the next few years. The way to prevent war is to prepare for it and let your enemy know you will fight with them with all you've got when and wherever you can. This is not the message we are sending to the Kremlin and not the message the British people are getting from those who want to lead us in the future. Nobody wants to fight the Russians. Nobody wanted to fight the Germans in 1914 or 1939 either, but the lessons on preparedness and military power we learnt from that time appear to be ignored. He's not technically right about one thing he said in the last bit. Nobody wanted to fight the Germans in 1914. Maybe I'm nitpicking here, but there was actually war hysteria in 1914. Just a little point there. But other than that, I think he makes very strong points here. I think there's far, far too much complacency, just like we have with China. Now, I don't think we're going to go to war with China, but there's far too much complacency. Um, Johnson, Truss, and Sunak have armed Ukraine. I think they've been on the right side of history with Ukraine. But as he says, there's just too many ifs. That should not be the case. Um, I think this idea of sending out ambiguity is quite clever because we shouldn't be advertising to Putin what we're going to do. So the idea of threatening to send, this idea of just dismissing it, oh, that isn't going to happen. I think we should basically suggest to Moscow that it might happen without putting it in concrete. That way, whilst behind closed doors, giving the Ukrainians assurances, the French have notched up rhetoric. Macron has openly spoken of this being a real possibility. Latvia has now got conscription for males of a certain age. So other countries are taking this seriously. I'm 38, so I'd probably be above the age of conscription. But if we got into a situation where we basically had to fight Russia, I would do it because I think the Putin regime is ghastly. I seriously considered actually joining the Ukraine Foreign Legion in 2022. In the end, I didn't because they got a little bit stricter on their criteria. I'd I'd actually been in the Royal Navy, but just at training level, and I was never approved in the end because of history of clinical depression. That was the reason they cited. But basically, what the Ukrainian embassy was saying is they were looking for people with basically battlefield experience, which I didn't have. But if we were now in a situation, a lot of people are saying, "Oh, I'll never sign up." That's up to their conscience. I'm not going to tell another man what he should and shouldn't do in this regard. But for me, I would go. I'm not saying I would do it happily. I'm not saying I'll be gung ho and all. It's war is not a trivial thing, but I would do it if I genuinely felt that Russia was to escalate things and invade Europe even more than it's already done so, and this country was under threat. Absolutely, I would go. Um, no one should be under any illusions. Putin is never going to stop. Um, some might be under the naive assumption that if there's some sort of peace agreement and Russia takes some territory, they'll just stop there. History shows otherwise. Look at what Russia did in Georgia in 2008 when the world was watching the opening ceremony of the Beijing Olympics. Understandably, there's been a lot of focus on Israel and Gaza, but the war in Ukraine is still very, very much a major war. And there's other conflicts in the world, Sudan, um, and others that are raging right now. In Myanmar, there's been significant offensives there. Apparently, various rebel groups have pushed back government forces in Myanmar. So there are other wars going on in the world, but we can't be complacent about this. Just one more thing related to that region, not necessarily about Ukraine. Chechnya has now banned music that is either too fast or too slow. The culture ministry there, and I quote, from now on, all musical, vocal, and choreographic works must correspond to the tempo of 80 to 116 beats per minute, Chechnya's culture ministry said in a statement. I mean, certainly Putin's running a foul regime, but mini Putin, Ramzan Kadyrov, runs a ghastly regime in Chechnya. Since the brutal wars there's been investment. It outwardly looks better. Buildings have been rebuilt. There's, skyscrapers and stuff. But Ramzan Kadyrov is a thug. I remember seeing a woman paraded on TV because she'd allegedly insulted him. This is the sort of regime he runs. I would dearly like to see the end of Ramzan Kadyrov. I'd like to see him meet the same fate as Prigozhin. He's a nasty piece of work. And anyway, that's basically like it's just slightly better than the Taliban. But yeah, not really related to what I'm talking about. It's just one of Putin's many stooges, Ramzan Kadyrov. I say many, not that many. There's Ramzan Kadyrov in Chechnya. There's Lukashenko in Belarus. Um, yeah, but Putin's never going to stop. I think we need to take this very seriously. Um, And I'm not saying I'm gung ho. I'm not saying, war is a terrible thing. I certainly wouldn't take pleasure from going to war, but if I had to do it, I would. I absolutely would.